It's in a way misleading to call it a new book. It's really a retrospective collection of thoughts about how somebody with modest intellectual ability could have come up with so many earth-shattering ideas. The ideas are simple. They're quite unprepossessing. If you see them laid out, you wouldn't think it would require great thought to have arrived at them. But in my, I'll say, humble opinion, I don't think they've had the influence on policy that I hope they would have. And so this is a book that's trying to make one last pitch to people to consider them in the policy domain seriously. Okay, the title springs from a collection of behaviors that I call smart for one, dumb for all. Maybe the simplest example is everybody stands up at a sporting event to see better. Nobody sees any better than if everybody had remained comfortably seated. People aren't irrational to stand up. They don't regret standing up. If they hadn't stood up, they wouldn't see it all. It's something they care about. But the outcome is still not first best. And my claim is that versions of that problem are what plague us primarily in life across every domain. Versions of that problem are the primary source of market failure, and all that would be of little interest, even if people believed it were true, if there weren't anything that we could do about it. But as I'll also argue in my presentation in a later session, we could actually solve these problems with fairly simple, unintrusive policy changes. So that's the idea I'm going to try to present to you. So I call this first part of the talk the underappreciated role of context. Context matters for everything, every judgment we make. Suppose you're driving your daughter, your 6-year-old daughter, to visit her grandparents. She asks, "Are we almost there yet?" Well, if there are 10 kilometers left on a 12-kilometer journey, you'll say, "No, we're just getting started. We won't be there for a while." If there are 10 kilometers left on a 320-kilometer journey, you'll say, "Hang on, we're just about there." Nobody thinks that's strange. That's just the way we evaluate things. Is it cold out? I grew up in Miami, Florida. If somebody asked, is it cold out on a 16-degree day in November, we knew the answer. Yes, it was as cold as it gets here. We wear the heaviest clothes we have to football games or wherever we're going out in that weather. If you ask somebody in Oslo, is it cold out on a 16-degree day in March, he thinks you're stupid for even asking. Can't you see how happy the people are in shirt sleeves celebrating the fine weather? So yes, obviously context matters. There are good reasons for it to matter. We're not defective because it shapes our judgments in those ways. Anybody who wasn't influenced by context in those ways would be ill-equipped to make his or her way in the world. One of the nicest examples, I think, of this kind of issue is due to one of my intellectual heroes, Thomas Schelling. He asked, why is it that the traffic in the southbound lanes gets backed up for hours when there's no obstruction in those lanes? There's an accident in the northbound lanes. Why is that? Well, the answer, he explained reasonably, was that when the motorist gets to the scene of the accident, she faces a choice. Shall I slow down and satisfy my curiosity about what's going on with all the red lights flashing over there, or shall I keep eyes straight ahead and speed along my way? That's an easy question. You're curious, of course you should slow down. 10 seconds, that's not going to cost you any real delay. What the motorist, of course, doesn't take into account that the extra 10 seconds it takes her to get where she's going as a result of that delay is hours of delay cumulatively for the motorists stacked up behind her. If motorists had to vote on whether they should all stop and satisfy their curiosity about what's going on, if they had the option of pushing a button and having a curtain go up between their lanes and the opposing lanes, they would push it. They wouldn't hesitate to push it. Nobody would spend 2 hours to get a better look at what's going on in the other lanes, but that's not how they make the decision. These decisions are smart for one, dumb for all. Now, I'm going to identify problems of this genre as the primary, or by far the most important source of market failure. I'm going to surprise you, I think, by sounding like a naive free marketeer much of the time. I think the people who have been most critical of markets utterly fail to appreciate how important they've been to achieving the modern era of prosperity. They're every bit as magnificent as the most naive free marketeer thinks they are. Adam Smith was the first to really get the story basically right. He saw that entrepreneurs introduce cost-saving innovations not for the benefit of society as a whole. That wasn't their motive. They were trying to steal business away from their rivals. He wasn't the first to make that observation. That was kind of a commonplace view. He took the story a little further, though, and pointed out that rivals didn't sit idly by once that happened. They were quick to copy the new product design improvements or cost-saving innovations. And in the competitive dogfight that ensued, prices were driven down to a level just consistent with covering the costs of production. The consumers got better, cheaper products in the end, and producers got only as much as they needed to eke out survival. That was his vision. It was an extraordinary vision, and the details were informative. He described how production got organized to completely transform the relationship between inputs and outputs. It used to be in his era of rural Scotland, you did every task for yourself. You made the wheels for the wagon, you made the planks for the bed of the wagon, the harness, everything you did for yourself. Specialization makes those kinds of tasks vastly more productive. I'll quote from the famous passage in his description of the operations of a pin factory. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed who could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day, 12 pounds. There are, in a pound, upwards of 4,000 pins of a middling size. Those 10 persons, therefore, could make among them upward of 48,000 pins in a day. For each person, therefore, making a 10th part of 48,000 pins might be considered as making 4,800 pins a day, but if they had all wrought separately and independently and without any of them having been educated to this particular business, they certainly could not, each of them, have made 20, perhaps not even 1 pin in a day. This is, I think, to appreciate the magnitudes here is the key to the story. It's not a small gain in productivity. It's an explosive gain in productivity. And if you look at the time path of GDP per capita in the world since as far back as we have any data that would make possible even reasonable guesses about it, it was essentially grounded at subsistent for virtually the entirety of human history until markets began to promote the division and specialization of labor. And then look, it becomes almost vertical. Now, with all this growth, of course, have come obvious problems. The climate crisis on my agenda, chief among them. You've seen the flooding. It's hit you close to home. It's hit us close to home. It's going to require an enormous amount of money to mitigate this problem. But if you want to really dig into the details, it's a problem that absolutely can be mitigated. There are in development now technologies that will suck large amounts of carbon out of the air. If we can't reduce our emissions quickly enough, we'll have to suck carbon out of the air. Those technologies are getting more powerful and cheaper day by day. They'll still be extremely expensive, but they'll be maybe 3–4% of world GDP. That's a rounding error compared to where we are. The question is whether we will be able to take the necessary step. That's still an open question, but we could solve this problem. Now, not everybody thought markets were so great. In fact, Smith didn't think they were so great all the time. As he wrote in one passage, men of the same trade seldom gather, even in merriment, but the conversation turns quickly to plots to raise prices or one conspiracy or another. As Marx put it, conditions in the workplace were pretty miserable in the industrial era. All means for the development of production transform themselves into domination over and exploitation of the workers. They mutilate the laborer into a fragment of the man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into hated toil. Read the 19th century accounts of the industrial workplace. That's no exaggeration. It's as if it's anything a gloss on how conditions were in the factories, and they were horrible. More modern writers, in particular Galbraith, thought powerful economic elites were the source of the problem. He said that things don't work the way they're described in traditional economics textbooks, where the traditional sequence says that producers try to discover what consumers want and then seek out the most efficient ways of producing and delivering those things to consumers. That's the traditional sequence. Galbraith said, no, don't be a chump, don't believe that. He offered in his 1967 book, The New Industrial State, what he described as the revised sequence, in which producers figured out what was cheapest and most convenient for them to produce, and then used the wizardry of psychology and Madison Avenue advertising techniques to persuade people to buy those things, whether they were in consumers' interests or not. Economists weren't impressed. They felt that this explanation lacked explanatory power. They asked, what about the Edsel, Professor Galbraith? The Edsel, most of you won't remember, was a product introduced in the 1950s by the Ford Motor Company with the biggest advertising budget ever seen for any product up until that time. Sorry. I'm not used to having two things to punch when I want the slides to go by. The Edsel, it was a flop. They discontinued making it after a year and a half. What do you say about the Edsel, Professor Galbraith? Oh, he would say, that's the exception that proves my rule. How does it prove his rule? It contradicts his rule. So what does that even mean to say it's the exception that proves my rule? I'll come back to that point. The claim that markets fail because of powerful economic elites does have a darker side, and it's one that I have been at pains to stress. It's that corporate elites have enormous power to shape the environments in which they operate through their ability to influence regulations and political candidates through election money. We're seeing that play out in a dramatic way in the US as I'm speaking to you now. That's something we need to worry about. But the idea that firms have an incentive to figure out what's convenient to produce and then try to fool you into buying it, that's not the biggest problem we face. Maybe you can find an example when that happens, but basically that's not an important problem. You mentioned the behavioral economics movement. I have a running debate with myself about whether I'm part of that movement. I was there at the founding. Richard Thaler was my Cornell colleague when we were talking about the ideas that really led to the development of that movement. And I completely accept his belief that merging economics and psychology yields useful insights about human behavior. The economic model is enriched by doing that. But I do not believe that the main sources of market failure have anything to do with behavioral economics, with mistakes that people make. There's Amos Tversky, whose work with Danny Kahneman was the inspiration for Thaler's early work. Tversky would say, my colleagues, they study artificial intelligence. Me, I study natural stupidity. He would give examples where you have all the information you have to get the right answer to the problem, and 90% of the people get the wrong answer. Yes, we make mistakes. It's completely clear that we make mistakes, and the mistakes are not random, they're predictable. And so behavioral economics has become a valuable source of advice for how to live better, how to avoid making these silly pitfalls that people fall into. But that's not an important source of market failure. If you were making a mistake that was really costly to you, there would be advice manuals bombarding you hour by hour about how to avoid that mistake. You can act unilaterally to correct mistakes that you make if they're important and they're costing you a lot of money. The mistakes that we make because individual and collective incentives are in conflict, much harder to correct. You have to organize. You have to persuade other people to adopt your point of view. You have to elect legislatures who are willing to act on these ideas. I can tell you from experience that's very difficult to do. So in fairness to Friedman and many of his free marketeer colleagues, they understood that markets weren't perfect, just as Adam Smith did, but their distrust of government, their skepticism about the possibility that government could take effective action was so deep that it didn't matter that markets were imperfect. If you turn a task over to the government, it's going to get much worse. He was famously quoted once as saying, if you put the government in charge of the Sahara Desert in 5 years, there would be a shortage of sand. Now, of course, the government does things that are wasteful. They approved a bill to build a bridge to nowhere in Alaska a few years ago. It wasn't a bridge to nowhere, but it was a bridge to an island that had on-the-hour ferry service that hardly anybody ever used, and was going to cost billions of dollars to build the bridge to make people able to go anytime they wanted. That was not a useful project. If you asked, were there better things those billions of dollars could have been put to use to do? So granted, government is imperfect, but if you look at a government budget in any detail, most of what's in it, even if you're the most skeptical observer of government, most of what is in it is stuff that people seem to approve of. It's health, it's retirement benefits, it's road maintenance, it's bridge building, where there actually are people who want to go to the places that they can go to on these bridges. There is waste, but it's not a big fraction of the total. I think critics of Friedman and his colleagues didn't really appreciate the strength of some of his arguments in favor of markets. He said famously that if the government regulates safety, it's forcing the worker to buy more safety than the worker wants to buy. And the underpinning of that argument is amazingly clear, simple, and sensible. Think about it this way. Suppose you were a self-employed machinist who worked on one of these lathes, and there were a guardrail available that would reduce your probability of injury. Should you install it? You're self-employed, there's no powerful firm exploiting you. Should you install it? Well, I think all economists would accept that when it comes to safety, there's no absolute safety attainable. We trade off costs and benefits to try to achieve an optimal level of safety. And so we would say, if the value to you as the self-employed lathe operator is greater than the cost of the guardrail that you could install on the lathe, of course you would install it. Let's suppose the value to you of the guardrail is 100, the cost is 50, you wouldn't hesitate. You'd be $50 a week better off if you installed it. But Friedman's point was that the exact same argument applies to the employer and the employee in that situation. Suppose the lathe guardrail costs 50. Suppose its value to the worker is 100. Rather than not install it, if the employer installs it and cuts wages by 75, the worker is 25 a week better off than before, and the employer is 25 a week better off than before. If the employer doesn't install that guardrail on the lathes, there will be cash on the table. And I don't care where you sit on the left, one of your slogans is not that greedy capitalists are leaving tons of cash on the table. That's not what greedy capitalists do. If there's extra money to be had, they take it. So in this situation, they would install the lathe. If we're going to come up with an explanation for why we need safety regulation, exploitation by powerful firms can't be the right one. It's just logically inconsistent with so many other things that we know. One other thing that has become clear to me in my study of biology is that competition is utterly ruthless. There aren't pockets of opportunity sitting there unclaimed. So we know that trees thrive best if they're growing in level, loamy, well-watered soils. Of course, that's what they'd prefer. But let there be even the most meager opportunity anywhere else, and some organism will find it. Let me read to you a naturalist's account. Here's a tree that's been growing for hundreds of years in a sheer vertical granite cliff face. In cliffs, roots may follow a lateral crack back into the rock until they find a vertical fissure. They fan out in a plane within that fissure until they encounter another crack going deeper. Filling that crack, they fan out along another fissure, creating several planes of root mass, which suck up every available bit of nutrients and moisture over a wide area. Competition in the marketplace is no less powerful than that. If there's an opportunity out there, everyone's looking for an opportunity. And our technical capacity to find opportunities now is better than it has ever been. So if there's a buyer who wants something and somebody who can produce that thing at a profit, to provide it for him. Does anybody doubt that they have better ability now to find one another than at any point in human history? That's just a truism. It's an obvious truth. Where we have to look for real improvement in welfare economic theory is not to behavioral economics, not to Marx and Galbraith, but to Darwin. Darwin had what I think was the central insight. In one of my books, I call it Darwin's wedge. His theory holds that traits are selected because of their impact on the reproductive fitness of individuals, not groups of individuals, but individuals. Traits that benefit individuals may benefit larger groups to which they belong, but they don't necessarily. There are lots and lots of examples of smart for one, dumb for all in the natural world, and these are instructive. First, an example of smart for one, smart for all. The invisible hand plays out just the way Adam Smith thought it would in nature in some instances. So take the eyesight of the hawk, the keen eyesight. If there were a phone book, there aren't even any phone books anymore, with a page on the back wall, a hawk sitting 100 yards further away than I am could read the numbers off of that phone book. They have unbelievably powerful resolution in their eyesight. How did it get to be that way? It was a simple Darwinian story. Hawks cruised above the valley floor looking for rodents. A mutation that coded for keener eyesight let the hawk in which it occurred catch more rodents, and Darwin's model was that the more resources you have, the more surviving offspring you lead. And so that mutation got passed on into the next generation, and it spread throughout hawks as a species so that now all hawks have keen eyesight. Keen eyesight is good for individual hawks. It's good for hawks as a group. Just like Adam Smith invisible hand narrative. But that's not always how it works. These are elephant seals. If you've never seen them, if you go to California, go down to Monterey and go to their rookery on a beach. Sorry. I'm feeling terribly inept. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm pushing buttons and nothing's happening. But so these are elephant seals. The one on the right is a male. The one on the left is a female. The one on the right weighs 2,000 kilos. They're 3 feet long. They're as big as the biggest SUV. They're unbelievable to see them in person. The cow on the left is 600 kilos. 1/5 the weight of the. Why is the male so much bigger than the female? It's because, Darwin argued, as in most vertebrate species, males take more than one mate if they can. They're polygynous is the technical term. The if they can qualifier is important because it means that if some males take more than one mate, other males don't get any mates at all, which is, of course, the ultimate loser slot in the Darwinian reckoning. And so, of course, males take every option at their disposal to make sure they're not left out in this game of musical chairs. The males square off against one another on the beach where the mating season occurs, and they battle one another for about 5 hours at a time. The red you see on their coats is blood from their battles. Finally, one of them slunks off, unable to continue, utterly exhausted. These battles are impossible to imagine how ferocious they are. The winner, circled here, gets near exclusive sexual access to a beach with anywhere from 50 to 100 females. Why did he win his fight? Well, it could have been a variety of reasons, but one of them would have been that he was bigger than his opponent. That's a factor. And so whatever mutation that made him bigger gets passed on into the pups of each of these females in the next round. And so bit by bit, males became 6 times as heavy as females. Is that a good thing? Well, yes and no. From the perspective of the individual male, if you weren't big, you wouldn't even have a chance to get a mate. So yeah, I guess you could call it a good thing. But from the perspective of males as a group, is it a good thing? Decidedly not. To the extent that size influences the outcome of the battle, it's relative size that matters, not absolute size. And so if each male weighed only 600 kilos, there'd be 1 winner and 1 loser in every fight, just as there is now. And yet the males would suffer fewer episodes of early arthritis, a consequence of their huge body mass. They would be much more maneuverable and better able to escape from their principal predator, the great white shark. They wouldn't have to eat such prodigious quantities of food to achieve and maintain their body mass. Life would be much better for them if it weren't for this smart for one, dumb for all problem that they confront. So back to the exception that proves the rule. How would you assess whether this Darwinian explanation of why males are bigger than females in most vertebrate species is a correct explanation? Would you find yet another vertebrate species where that's true? That's not a very methodologically sound path of investigation. What you would do is try to look for a species where the conditions assumed in the argument aren't met. And lo and behold, this is the albatross. They live to be about 50 or 60 years old. They mate early in life, and they stay mated to the same partner for the entirety of their adult existence. They're monogamous. Males don't take more than 1 mate if they can. They take 1 mate. So there's really no advantage in being bigger than other males if you're a male albatross. And sure enough, if you're an albatross, how do they tell if you're a male or a female? You can't tell. I can't tell. You need to be an ornithologist to know what to look for to be able to tell. That's the exception that proves the rule. And I think you have to understand the English verb to prove in the old sense. It's the exception that tests the rule. The edsel is not the exception that proves Galves's claim that sellers can sell you anything they want. Well, you want examples of smart for one, dumb for all? There are lots of them. A tree asks, how tall do I need to be? Well, I need to be tall enough to get light. Well, how tall is that? It depends on the other trees around me. Where do I have to position myself to see at a football game? It depends on what other people around me are doing. So we have trees that are growing to be hundreds of feet tall, and the only part of them that matters is the part right up there at the top. If they were all 5 feet tall, they'd be able to get just as much light as before. Now, we might be glad that they face that particular smart for one, dumb for all problem. Look at all the lumber we get because they grow so tall. Okay, that's fine. But from their point of view, if they had preferences in the matter, this is a bad outcome. It's a waste of resources. So let me go into the social policy domain now more directly. Let's imagine 2 different conditions. An initial condition, I'm calling it condition 1, all cars weigh 1,200 kilos. There was a day not so long ago when that was descriptive. And in that initial condition, a renegade motorist buys a car weighing 4,000 kilos. Why did he do that? He said, I wanted to increase my probability of surviving an accident. Was he right that Buying that car did increase his probability of survival? Absolutely. Let one of these 1,200 kilo cars run into this car, he won't even notice that the car ran into him. He'll just drive merrily along. What's the best response of the owners of the 1,200 kilo cars? Well, they're now at greater risk than they were before because he's driving that massive 4,000 kilo car. Their best response may be to buy one for themselves. And then the new equilibrium is one when everybody is driving a 4,000 kilo car. Everybody in that new situation has a greater risk of injury and death than everybody in the original situation. Smart for one, dumb for all. That was. Now, this sounds like, and I know a lot of people whose impulses I respect greatly get nervous when they see examples like this because they see it as an invitation for meddlesome government regulators to tell you what you should buy and what you shouldn't. That's not the policy prescription that comes out of this view of the problem. What's the problem? That bigger cars cause harm to others. Why do they cause harm? It's primarily a consequence of their greater mass. They're more likely to injure others because of their greater mass. Why not discourage people from buying cars with greater mass, not by making them against the law, but by taxing them by weight? If we taxed vehicles by weight, that recognizes that some people actually need a bigger vehicle. And yes, they're putting other people at risk when they buy one, but they will compensate for that by enabling other people to pay lower taxes and enjoy more of the other good things in life because they paid higher taxes. That's a much better and more flexible response to this kind of market problem. Don't see lurking here the heavy hand of government meddlesome regulation. It's not really where this analysis is pointing. Okay, now comes the theory section of my talk. And in the US, certainly, I don't know if it's true here in Germany, but if I call this the theory section of my talk at any frontline economics department, people would laugh and scoff. Why? Because there really isn't any math in it. It's a theory. There's no math in it. A theory should be as complicated as it needs to be to make the point that you're trying to make. And it's a theory that rests on two simple thought experiments, ones that ask you to summon your knowledge of how you feel about events in the world. So in the first, well, I should say both of them are choices between two worlds you could go live in. Your world's about to blow up. You got to go live in one of these worlds. And they both entail a choice between absolute advantage and relative advantage. Okay, so in the first one, it's about house size. In world A, you and other families live in 400 square meter houses. You and your family live in 400 square meter houses. Others live in neighborhoods where the houses are 600 square meters. That's world A. In world B, you and your family live in a neighborhood with 300 square meter houses. Others live in neighborhoods with 250 square meter houses. Which would you choose? Now, according to textbook economics, the utility of any good depends on its attributes. In most cases, it's absolute attributes. So a house, how big is it? How many bathrooms does it have? What's the kitchen like? Is there a yard, a porch, all those things? And in that model, world A is the uniquely correct choice. It's a bigger house. Of course you'd move there. But when you ask real people what would they choose in this setting, most people choose world B. Many of the people who choose world A choose it because they think they shouldn't care how big their house is compared to how big other people's houses are. And maybe they don't care. But I would choose world B, and I don't care how big my house is relative to how big other people's houses are. There are good reasons to care about that, quite apart from that. But for now, let me just ask you to note that empirically, most people choose world A when given this choice. So in a choice between absolute advantage and relative advantage, they choose just what the economic textbook, they choose just what the economic textbook says they shouldn't choose. They choose relative advantage. Here's the second thought experiment. In world A, it's again a choice between absolute and relative advantage. World A is absolutely safer. You have a 2 in 100,000 chance of dying on the job. Others have a 1 in 100,000 chance. So your job in world A is twice as risky as everyone else's job. In world B, you have the safest job. Your chance of dying is 4 in 100,000 each year. Others have a 6 in 100,000 chance of dying. Which would you choose? I said in the earlier choice, some people chose the absolutely large houses, but most people didn't. Here, I've never run this experiment where anybody has chosen world B. Is that because they don't notice that they have a relatively risky job in world A? I think I would notice if I had the riskiest job of all. But if the only way to do anything about that is to double your risk of dying on the job, no, I'm not going to do that. I'll stay in world A. Okay, if anybody thinks that my characterization of these choices is unreasonable, I'd love to hear why. I've never heard a cogent account of, oh, no, that's not the way people would choose in situations like this. It's how they choose. So this is Fred Hirsch, who died sadly much before his time. Following his terminology, I'm going to call housing a positional good in this pair of examples, and safety a non-positional good. A positional good is one whose value depends heavily on how it compares with others in the same category. A non-positional good, in most cases, also depends on how it compares with others in the same category, but much less so than in the case of a positional good. Okay, that's the background to the theory. Here's the theorem. It's an analogy. Positional goods are to non-positional goods as bombs are to toasters. I'll have to explain what I mean. The right-hand side of the analogy refers to the categories of goods at stake in military arms races. We can build more bombs, or we can build more of other things: schools, roads, hospitals, toasters, televisions. I'm letting toasters stand in for everything else. So what the theorem says is that the relationship between positional goods and non-positional goods is exactly analogous to the relationship between bombs and toasters. Why do we see military arms races in the first place? It's because a nation's stock of relative armaments is more important to its survival than its stock of relative toasters. If they have better toasters than we have, we don't like that, but we can live with that. If they have more bombs than we have, we not only don't like that, that may mean the end of us. And so whenever one good is more context sensitive than another good, we see a positional arms race. Resources get siphoned out of the toasters bucket and poured into the bombs bucket, as in a military arms race. In the same fashion, they get siphoned out of non-positional goods in order to be able to pay for more positional goods. That's the theorem. if you saw a premise on which the theorem is based that you think is empirically poorly grounded, come and tell me about it when you're done. Nobody seems to have anything to say about that. Is the logic faulty? Nobody has anything to say about that. So this is a contradiction of the claim that markets get everything right. If our evaluations of some goods are more context dependent than of others, then we get a distortion in the allocation of free consumer choices about what to buy. And the distortion is away from non-positional goods towards positional goods. I'm going to have to stress now the role. I'm pushing the button again and again, and nothing is happening this time. So shall I just tell you to push it if it... Let me do a quick aside on the link between school quality and neighborhood house prices, which is an important linchpin in the argument. In every jurisdiction on earth, school quality varies from one local jurisdiction to another. And what's true in every country, even in France, where I lived for a year, the curriculum was the same in every school in the country. The school expenditures per pupil were the same in every school in the country. Still, if you lived in Paris, you wanted your kids to go to school in the 16th arrondissement and not in the 20th. Why? Because there were the students of more prosperous families who had learned more before they started school, who were in those schools. The pace of learning would be greater in those schools. Your kids would become better educated if they went to those schools. So every parent, or almost every parent, wants his or her children to go to the best possible schools. And what that means is buying a house in the best neighborhood you can afford, the most expensive neighborhood you can afford. So think about that. Elizabeth Warren, one of our senators in the US, and her daughter wrote a book before she became a senator. It was called The Two-Income Trap. Why, they asked, could parents in the 1950s live comfortably on just the husband's paycheck when in the 1990s, when they were writing, it was a struggle to get by even when both spouses were working. And their answer, in a nutshell, was that the second paycheck went into a largely fruitless bidding war for houses in better school districts. And this is the rub. When everybody bids for a house in a better school district, we succeed only in bidding up the prices of those houses. Half of all children still go to bottom half schools, the same as before. So now I think we're ready to see the logic behind my critique of Friedman's argument against government safety regulation. You're a worker. You could work at a riskier job and get higher pay. How can you get higher pay at a riskier job? Because they didn't have to put on that expensive guardrail. Why might you want to do that, even though if you were working all by yourself on a desert island, you would install it? Because if I get more money, I can bid more effectively for a house in a better school district. What you rationally overlook in that process is that other people have agency here too. They confront the same decision. And if it's worth it to you to sacrifice your safety to bid more effectively for a house in a better school district, it's also worth it to them to do that. And so you all sell your safety. You work in the factory without the guardrail on the lathe. And you still end up, the same families as before, send their children to bottom half schools. You haven't bought anything you care about. This is not a problem that solves itself. Every society on earth has some form of safety regulation. And it's not because monopoly companies have the power to exploit their workers. Think about it, what a silly explanation that actually is. if you dig into it. The companies on the right, Google, Microsoft, Apple, are virtually unaffected by safety regulations. Their employees, each and every one of them, works under conditions much safer than the regulations require. They have enormous market power. The Justice Department has found Google guilty of exploiting its market power unjustly, blah, blah. What are they going to do? Nobody knows. But these companies have market power. Safety regulation isn't needed to protect their employees from risks in the workplace. They don't face risks in the workplace. Who faces risks in the workplace? It's the people at McDonald's and other low-end, low-wage labor market employees. The monopsony power the market power explanation is just not a cogent explanation for why we need to regulate safety. I'll come back to Galbraith again. In his 1957 book, The Affluent Society, he argued that societies would be much happier if we spent much more on public goods and much less on private goods. I completely agree with that assessment. I disagree with his inference about why societies spent more on private goods and too little on public goods. As he wrote famously, the family which takes its mauve and cerise, air-conditioned, power-steered, and power-braked automobile out for a tour passes through cities that are badly paved, made hideous by litter, blighted buildings, billboards, and posts for wires that should have long since been put underground. Absolutely correct. We would be much happier if we had fewer, I mean, it's quaint how these luxuries in automobiles of his day are considered the very most minimal features a car needs to have now. But absolutely correct. We're spending way too much on private goods and much too little on public goods. And if we look ahead, we can see that continuing that vein is likely not to produce a good outcome. So I'm thinking about the US context here. If we continue under current policies, we'll have Society A. We could, if we adopted different policies, transition to Society B. So which would be better? To have bigger houses, spend more on wedding receptions. That's the average current expenditure on wedding receptions in the US compared to what it was just 3 decades ago, and just even adjusting for inflation. There's evidence that people are no happier because they're spending that much more on their wedding receptions. Average vacation time, 2 weeks versus 5 weeks. Infrastructure quality, poor versus good. Renewable energy, 40% versus 100%. Hospital surge capacity, and so on. I think there's a huge literature on the determinants of human flourishing, and every study in it supports the claim that Society B would have people who are more closer to an ideal of human flourishing than those in Society A. And what's the difference?
That should be switched, right? Climate mitigation is high in Society B.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I just added that this morning. That should be low and high in the last line. Thank you. And we have actually some empirical data on this. Every year there's the World Happiness Report. What they ask you is, all things considered, how happy are you with how satisfied are you with your life these days on a 10-point scale? 10 means you're as satisfied as you can imagine being. 0 means you can't imagine things being any worse. And people are reasonably satisfied in most countries, but year after year, these 5 countries are in the top 5. And year after year, the US is the lowest rank among all the wealthy countries. And what's different between the US and that other group of countries is the list of things. Well, I can't go back. The list of things that I was comparing with society A and society B. Does that mean that's the cause of these differences in happiness? No, we can't say for sure that's true, but it would be awkward for my argument if it were the reverse in this table. If the US were on top, people say we don't dare tax the rich any more heavily. That will stifle entrepreneurship and initiative. Sweden, which taxes the highest earner at a marginal rate of 53%, has 50% more billionaires per capita than the US, which taxes the highest earners at 37%. So a lot of these arguments are poorly rooted in empirical evidence. The idea that we can't regulate, that we can't engage in social programs, it's not a well-grounded set of arguments. Now, I have a second presentation to run through. I was told I had an hour and a half. I thought I didn't have more than an hour to say about that first round. I can take some questions now and allow some discussion, or move right into the second presentation, which is a very different take on the smart for one, dumb for all dichotomy, but one that's been very much on my mind for many decades.
Many studies looking at the cost of climate mitigation efforts, but the lowest cost options as having a net profitability. So this is without incentives.
You're talking about climate now.
Talking about climate, yeah. And so without incentives, you get a bunch in the negative area in the cost curve. How would you explain that in this framework?
I don't think I understood your question. What am I trying to explain?
So
what's the mystery?
Look at McKinsey's cost curve, look at other cost curves, rank mitigation options from least expensive to most expensive. The curve starts negative, then it crosses 0, then it goes up. How do you explain the negative?
When you say the curve starts negative, that means what exactly?
Net cost is negative.
Means we invest in mitigation and we get more back right away than we spent?
There is a positive economic benefit for the person who invests in these lowest cost options.
Well, we are, in fact, investing like mad in them. I mean, Texas, which is the U.S. state probably most hostile to public action of any kind, is the leading producer of solar and wind energy in the U.S. And it's driven exactly by the fact that you can make money doing that now. Producers are rushing to adopt a lot of these mitigation measures, but the IPCC estimates that even getting to zero emissions, we'll never get to zero emissions, but even getting to zero emissions by the most ambitious targets that have been set, we will need to suck massive quantities of CO2 out of the air in order to prevent unacceptably high levels of warming. And when you hear the term unacceptably high level of warming, I'd say we're already at unacceptable high levels of warming at 1.5 degrees centigrade. We're seeing storms, fires, droughts like never before, causing way more damage than anybody ever imagined. So what I did was I calculated under the projected costs of sucking carbon out of the air. Climeworks in Iceland has a method. There are several other methods under development. It would cost something like 3% of GDP a year in order to pay for sucking out all the carbon they say we need to suck out. And ask yourself, how big a cost is that? During the financial crisis, GDP went down by more than 3%, and the growth curve resumed at a forever lower 3%. And we've managed okay in the interim of that. So could we part with 3% of GDP forever if that meant sucking out all the carbon? Of course we could. Somebody from Adam Smith's day would think, what a bunch of sissies if you look at how you live. You can't spend a little money on protecting against the level of catastrophe. No, it's an easy call if you, but even though things are an easy call, we don't do it. I think in the US election that's about to occur, it's an easy call. And yet the experts are saying we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah.
I've got two questions, or two comments rather. First, on the example you gave with the bigger cars being safer, actually empirically that's not true. Like bigger cars, especially SUVs, tend to flip over and therefore have a higher chance of accidents. So it's more the perception of safety than actual safety. And then second thing, a question, when you were saying that investors, or no, house prices tend to rise or have risen historically because people want to live in better neighborhoods and they bet each other out. But isn't that ignoring the whole systemic aspect of real estate property development being a thing and people investing in more housing than they need themselves and expecting private institutions to build houses instead of governments which have no profit incentive?
I don't know anything at all about the latter point you made. On the first point you made, it was true with the early SUVs, which were built on truck chassis, that they did have a higher rollover probability and they were less safe. The SUVs today are built on car chassis and they no longer have a higher rollover probability. But when everybody has an SUV, everybody is less safe than when everybody had a small car. That was the point of the argument. Okay, let me go ahead then. Everybody in this room will be familiar with the one-shot prisoner's dilemma. It's a simple one-period game where there are two options, cooperate or defect. If you and your partner cooperate, you get a higher payoff than if you and your partner both defect. But the highest payoff of all comes when you defect and your partner cooperates. So the dominant strategy in that game is to defect. And the prediction of standard economic models is that that's what people will do. In fact, that's not what people do when we do experiments with one-shot prisoners' dilemmas. A surprisingly high percentage of people do cooperate, especially if they've had a chance to talk to one another, even as strangers who never expect to meet again. But that's the assumption that underlies the dominant model in our price theory courses, that people are basically self-interested. They will. And that's clearly an example of smart for one, dumb for all. If you both cooperated, you'd get a better outcome than if you both defect. But it's smart to defect. When you both defect, you get a worse outcome. Smart for one, dumb for all there too. So Here's a thought experiment. We've got a CEO of a company. He's got an opportunity to increase his earnings by 30% for sure by telling a lie that could not possibly be detected. How likely do you think it would be that he would do that? Well, there's one and only one answer in the economics textbook model. Of course he would tell that lie. There would be a benefit and no cost. Now, you could say there are economists who recognize that, in fact, there are CEOs who would not tell a lie in this situation. What would they say? They would say, well, we have honest CEOs and they get a warm glow from being honest. A warm glow. And some emotional pleasure from being honest. Descriptively, why do you give to, in the USA, they tell us give to public radio or we won't be able to put these programs on and you value them. Well, they'll put the same programs on or not, whether I give or not. My gift won't matter. So why do I give? Because I get a warm glow, say the economists who are willing to admit that, yes, there are people who give when they hear this appeal. But that's a red letter problem for the Darwinian model. The Darwinian model is the only scientific model we have about why we care about the things we care about. The Darwinian model says what really matters is how many surviving offspring you leave. And for that, what matters most is how much do you control in the way of real resources. So if you have an opportunity to lie without being punished and get more real resources, the Darwinian model seems to say you should get a warm glow from lying, not from telling the truth. And to me, working on this decades ago, I was always astonished that biologists weren't more interested in that problem, why they weren't more puzzled. I mean, many would acknowledge that, yes, there are people who seem to take pleasure in doing the right thing, but how would a brain have been rewarded for that under this system that you describe so eloquently? It doesn't hold logical sense. They've thought about the question of cooperation. A good friend of mine, Robert Trivers, published a paper called The Evolution of Reciprocal Altruism. People do nice things for other people. They incur costs for other people, in the expectation that the favor will be returned. Almost all of the biological attempts to explain altruism or cooperation involve a repeated game context. Things where I'll be nice this time, that will make you trust me, we'll have a long run of cooperation in the future. I have absolutely no quarrel with any of that, but that's not the question we're trying to answer here. Why would you do it even when there's no penalty for cheating? So reciprocal altruism, most of the time there won't be reciprocation, and that's not the question we're trying to answer in any event. Here's William Hamilton, who unfortunately died too soon. His theory of kin selection was one that attempted to solve this problem. You could actually incur costs that would not benefit you at all if it were of sufficient benefit to organisms that carried enough of your own genes. It's the genes that you're trying to propagate into the next generation, not just you, it's genes like the ones you carry. So it would make sense, biologically speaking, to sacrifice your own life to save two siblings or three siblings, because more of your genes would survive that way than if you survived. or if you would save 12 cousins, it would make sense to lay down your own life. But that's not what we're trying to explain here. This is not, and anyway, people will say, well, we're used to behaving the way the kin selection model predicted because we grew up in small hunter-gatherer bands where everyone was closely related to one another. Yes, we did have more relatives in our groups at the time when we were evolving, but still relationships were quite different, one person versus another. If you're a second cousin with someone, you have 3.25% of your genes in common. You don't grow up indiscriminately doing benefits for other people because they might be related to you in some unspecified degree. You would always be much more discriminating than that. Here's David Sloan Wilson. He's very big on group selection, cultural groups, the groups that had effective norms that discouraged cheating were successful in competition with groups that didn't have effective norms. Absolutely right. That's correct. But that doesn't answer the specific question I'm trying to focus us on. What would you do if there were no penalty for breaking the norms that are in effect? We know there are people who break them. We had a president who breaks them at every turn. And the Darwinian model is pretty clear. If you break them only when it's to your advantage to break them, and there's another type that always follows the rules, then in the competition to see who leaves more offspring, the cheater is going to outcompete the rule follower. And yet that hasn't happened. And I was never able to get a satisfactory explanation from any of my biologist friends why they weren't more worried about that, why they weren't more worried about the fact that the theory hadn't really tackled that question satisfactorily. And so by chance, three people, quite independently of one another, started working on this very question at the very same moment. When I say at the very same moment, I don't literally mean that, but as far as I can tell, nobody knows who was working on it first. David Gautier is a philosopher. He published his book in 1985, so he probably got there a little bit ahead of us, but he was so deficient in his analysis that I don't think he really counts. Jack Hirschleifer, my fellow economist, got much closer in his 1987 paper, The Emotions as Guarantors of Threats and Promises. And my first paper on this subject was, if Homo economicus could choose his own utility function, would he want one with a conscience? And I offered a tentative answer of yes to that question. And if you look at publication lags in the American Economic Review, maybe I was ahead of Hirschleifer here, I don't know. We were at about the same time. But the basic idea was, if you were in a prisoner's dilemma, a one-shot dilemma, such as the branch outlet problem I described in this chart. Here we have an owner of a local business knows that her business would be a huge success in a city 300 kilometers away. The only problem is she can't manage it herself, and if the person she hired to manage it dishonestly, she would lose money. So in the time sequence, she interviews a manager at point A. Of course, the manager promises he will manage honestly. Why would a cheater say, I'll cheat you if you hire me? They would not say that. Then if she opens the office at B, It's the manager's choice, shall I cheat or not? If I cheat, I'm at branch C. If I don't cheat, I get 1,000. If I do cheat, I get 2,500. What am I going to do? If she hires me, I'm going to cheat. If she doesn't open the office, I don't have any opportunity to cheat. I'll just get $500 I'd earn at some other job, and the owner of the business gets nothing extra. What's best for the owner here? Well, she looks at it from the perspective of the manager and says to herself, if I hire him at C, his incentive will be to cheat. I'm not going to open the business. Smart for one, dumb for all. If they could both make a commitment not to cheat, if the manager could make a commitment not to cheat, that would be better for him and for the owner. They would both end up with a 1,000 payoff rather than the 500 zero payoff. So how can the prospective manager persuade the owner that he won't cheat? It's clearly not sufficient to say, I won't cheat, because clearly the cheating manager has an incentive to say that too. So there has to be a statement that is very difficult to make unless you're somebody who has the characteristics that you're claiming to have. I'll show you this art model drawing from the New Yorker that captures the basic idea of my argument in a nutshell. We have the pencil salesman and the potential buyers. We imagine the wife saying, we ought to buy a pencil. We don't need a pencil, says the husband. Well, if we don't buy a pencil, he'll whip us. Poppycock, says the husband, he wouldn't use the whip. If he uses the whip, he'll go to jail. Nobody would use the whip just to sell a pencil if he knew it meant going to jail. That argument isn't persuasive for one reason, and the reason is the expression on the pencil salesman's face. So go back to your room tonight or wherever you go, look in the mirror and try to manifest that expression in the mirror. It's very difficult to look that way unless you really are not playing by the customary rules up there. If I could have been a cartoonist, if I had the talent, I would have loved to do that. It's the most noble profession out there, other than being an economist. So it's amazing how in just a few ink strokes they can convey so much information about intention. That guy is not playing with a full deck. He might not reason that it wouldn't be worth his while to spend time in jail just to sell a pencil. So we buy the pencil. And the beauty of it from his point of view is that then he doesn't need to use the whip. That's the mechanism I'm going to try to sketch for you. You've just gotten home from a crowded concert. This thought experiment is meant to test your intuition about whether you can identify who would not cheat you in a context in which it would be impossible for you to know whether you had been cheated. So you've just gotten home from a crowded concert. You had 10,000 euros in an envelope with your name and address on it. You get home, the envelope is no longer in your coat pocket. You remember that sound you heard when you put your coat on it as you got up to leave the concert. That must have been the envelope falling from your coat pocket. Can you think of anybody who's not related to you by blood or marriage who would return your envelope if she or he found it? Most people think about that, and they say, yeah, I can name some people I feel certain would return my envelope. They usually name several. Most people will even say, I know at least some people who would return a perfect stranger's envelope. Most of the people they name are friends of long standing. How do you know? Well, I know that person so well, she would feel horrible at the mere idea of keeping my money. Has she ever returned your money before under similar circumstances? Well, no, of course not. That's never happened before. Well, how do you know? They just know. Well, if you feel you know, we have evidence that your intuition is more than just statistical luck. People are pretty good at predicting who would cheat and who wouldn't in one-shot prisoner's dilemmas when there's cash money at stake and nobody's ever going to know. If people say they don't know any such person, I think you might want to think again about how you've organized your lives. I mean, maybe you need to get out more, make more friends. It's not normal not to know somebody you feel would return your money. Okay, how do we know what's going on in somebody's brain? I think she would feel so bad that she just wouldn't think about doing that. Well, Darwin, from whose 1872 book this drawing comes, felt there were windows inside the brain. There are autonomic nerves that fire spontaneously in certain contexts. So the dog on the left is about to do battle with a rival over a bone or a mate. Every element of its posture is functional in that respect. The hairs on its back are standing on end. The tiny follicles that surround the hairs constrict instantly and make them stand up. Dogs have an algorithm that says if the other dog's bigger, don't fight with him. That's why that happens. They have fangs bared. They're ready to spring forward. The ears are pricked to hear better. Their eyes are darting back and forth. Their fangs are bared to show their weaponry. All that happens in an instant. And Darwin said it's all involuntary. It's arousal in the dog's brain. And we can tell for sure that's happening inside the dog's brain because if it weren't happening, that dog never would have made it this far. Each one of those details is serviceable in the act of winning a fight with another dog. And if you don't do that, you lose. This dog is greeting its master. Most of the details are opposite. So can we, Hirschleifer and I said moral emotions were the things that drove us to do the right thing. I asked Gautier, the philosopher, at a conference once, he said it would be rational for a country's leader to predispose herself to retaliate against a nuclear first strike. Even though retaliating against first strike would ensure nuclear winter, the whole world would die. If we just gave up after a first strike, at least we would survive. It would be rational to predispose yourself to respond to a first strike with retaliation. How would the adversary know you had predisposed yourself to do that? And he hadn't even thought about that question. That's the central question. Hirschleifer said it was the emotions that would predispose you to do that, but he hadn't himself either considered how people would know that you were emotionally proposed to do something. Here was Darwin saying we at least had a window that would enable us to make statistically reliable inferences about emotional states in another creature's brain. That was the first step along an answer to that question. I thought it was a much bigger step along that path than it turned out to be. It turns out that in the human face, there are certain combinations of muscle movements that occur spontaneously when we experience certain emotions, but that are very difficult to make voluntarily. So, for example, there are it doesn't seem to be a pointer on this thing. there are muscles at the bridge of the nose, those are the pyramidal muscles, and those at the center of the brow, the corrugator muscles, that are very difficult to operate in concert to produce this expression. This is a diagram I produced myself. I don't have any training in art. I can show it in Germany, I can show it in Nepal, I can show it anywhere on earth and say to people, what is this person feeling? And I'll get pretty consistent responses. This person is feeling concerned, is feeling grief, is feeling anxious, feeling upset. Again, go back to where you go and stand in front of a mirror and try to elevate your brows in the center as you corrugate your forehead. And you won't be able to do that. Trained actors can do it. Some of them can. They sometimes do it by imagining when their dog got run over by a car, and that makes them feel sad, so they experience the emotion which causes the expression. Yogis can maybe gain control. It's very difficult to fake this if you're not in either of those categories. So if you're walking with a friend and you stub your toe and it's bleeding and you don't see that expression, ask yourself, is this really a friend? Or is this somebody who merely pretends to care about me? I thought I was done. I saw Darwin's picture of the book and this later work by our ability to identify the link between emotions and expressions as being all you need. I wrote in my 1988 book, Passions Within Reason, a blush may reveal a lie and cause great embarrassment at the moment, but in circumstances that require trust, there can be great advantage in being known to be a blusher. I thought I was done. But then I read about Nico Tinbergen's derivation principle. This emotion has to be a recognizable signal to another person. And for something to be a signal, it has to satisfy the basic evolutionary rule that each mutation that leads to it has to be advantageous right from the beginning. And so if there is a signal of an emotion that says you care about this person, that's why you're not going to cheat them, the very first mutation that led to the first increment towards that expression wouldn't have had any meaning. They wouldn't have known what it meant. So it couldn't have been selected as a signal. If it was to serve as a signal, it had to have been selected for some other reason. And Tinbergen's derivation principle said that it has to have evolved as a signal originally purely by accident. The example of the dung beetle is really instructive. The dung beetle avoids predation by looking like a piece of shit. How did it get to be that way? Well, if it didn't look like a piece of shit to any of its potential predators, there would have been no advantage to looking how it looked. Only when it looked enough like a piece of shit to fool the most myopic of its predators could selection begin to work on its appearance for that reason. So now once it's fooled a predator, then another small mutation can make it look even more like a pile of dung. And we know that mimicry and signaling of this sort can be spectacularly detailed and effective. That's the dead leaf beetle. Can you imagine that's the wing of the beetle and not a dead leaf. It's astonishing that evolution could make a wing of a beetle look like that. But it can. But only if its wing looked initially like a dead leaf to have fooled at least some of the things that would have eaten it. So that's the argument. We looked at whether people could identify who would cooperate in one-shot prisoners' dilemmas. We had people in groups of 3 talk to one another. They would play prisoner's dilemma in separate rooms in pairs. So I would, as the subject in this experiment, fill out 2 forms, once saying whether I would cooperate or defect with each of the 2 partners, one predicting whether each of the 2 partners would cooperate or defect with me. The defection rate was only about 25% in these experiments. That's not a surprising finding, except to economists, because it's been done so many times. But we were interested in whether people could predict who would cooperate and who would cheat. So when people predicted defection, if their predictions had no value, they would have been right by chance 25% of the time, because that was the defection rate. They were right almost 2/3 of the time. Astonishingly accurate with people they had talked with for only 30 minutes. We'd be much better, I'd have to think, predicting behavior of people we knew well. We then kept track of what subjects people had studied in school, and the economists in our sample were much more likely to defect than others in the sample. And was this a matter of training or just that the people chose to become economics majors were a little more cynical to begin with? We found evidence that the training effect mattered. We compared beginning of term, end of term behavior for first economics, microeconomics students, first-year students in one class, first-year astronomy students in another class, and the economics students became much more cynical in their predictions about the behavior of others after 6 months in the course. Okay. I leave on the slide the earlier thought experiment that I posed to you. Do you know somebody you feel? Have confidence in your intuition on questions like this. Probably you actually do know somebody who would, 10,000 euros, that's a lot of euros. There would be, and the person who finds it would know that this is a crowded arena. Nobody would know. I found it. And there'd be lots of rationalizations you can imagine offering for why it would be okay just this time to do something wrong. But people really are out there who would get a warm glow from doing the right thing. We proposed doing an experiment to test this, and the Human Subjects Committee refused permission to do it. Probably they were right to do that. Anyway, that's 2 very different dimensions of smart for one, dumb for all. I don't know whether this book will ever be published. I thought I would give it to Princeton University Press, who has done most of my most recent books. The reason I started working on this book to begin with was I wanted to sort of trace the history of how I come to think about these things. And so there's an autobiographical component to the manuscript. And we got a nice letter back from the editor saying, this is fascinating, blah, blah, blah. But we found that genre of memoir is not a genre we've been successful with. So my longtime publisher doesn't want to publish it. I don't know if I'll be able to find another publisher. If I can't, send me an email. I'll send you a copy of the draft manuscript. I'd be happy to hear your advice and commentary. But that's what I was hoping to have a chance to talk to you about today. And thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I'll be glad to hang around and take questions if you have any.